uh, blocked in existing brownfield infrastructure in assets can be sold to private sector agents, and the money obtained then can be used for further investments in infrastructure. Okay. Of course, there is no transfer of ownership, but only a transfer of management for a specified period of time. And the government is thinking in terms of generating something like 6 lakh crores in the next 4 years. That is 2022 to 25 period, you know. And now we have a very distinguished panel here consisting of two academicians and two people from the industry. And, and all of them are specialists in this area. And they have also, three of them have actually written about this in the newspapers quite recently. And so the way we are going to do is I will start with the people from the industry, and then go on to the a person from the academia, and then again from the industry, and then from the academia. So I will start with Manish Agarwal. Manish is actually a partner and head energy and infrastructure mergers and acquisitions special situations group at KPMG India. He has over 2 decades of transaction and consulting experience in the infrastructure space, both in India and abroad, in a number of other countries as well. So, in fact, among the four panelists, I think he seems to be the one who is directly dealing with infrastructure financing. Now, Manish, by way of training, holds a Bachelor's of Engineering from the University of Delhi, Delhi College of Engineering, and he has done a Master in Finance and Control from the University of Delhi. So, Manish, a very warm welcome to CDS, and I don't think you have been to CDS at all. And although your boss is a very close friend of ours, you know, and so very warm welcome. And the floor is yours for about 15 minutes and thereabouts.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Sunil, and thanks, CDS, for providing this opportunity to me. And good afternoon, everyone, and my fellow co-panelists as well. Now, I think if you look at the National Monetisation Pipeline, I mean, which the government announced, I will share my views into two sort of a parts. The first part is I believe that it is a pretty bold and a significant reform for three reasons. First, I think this is the first time that the government has laid out a roadmap for foreign investors, domestic investors who have been wanting to come into infrastructure, but have always felt that our approach has been little episodic or transactional. So we did one roads monetization program, TOT, the first one. Then we come out with airport privatization after a year and a half. And after that, investors are not aware what happens next. So it lays down a very clear roadmap over the next 4 years. Second, I think this is the first time where the choice to the investors has been broadened up quite significantly, which means so far, if you look at the attempts at the asset monetization, which is largely focused on the highways and a little bit on airports when we did a privatization. This is the first time where the government is actually saying that you come and pick and choose a sector that you would want to work on. So right from a gas pipelines to renewables, to hydros, to logistic and warehousing infrastructure, some very interesting sector play has been proposed to be opened up. I think that's a very bold sort of an initiative, which I would say is the second part. The third also is that this is the first time where the government is also nudging state governments to probably act over it as well, and through the incentive structure that is being laid out. So what the center is saying is that to the states that you're also wanting resources to invest in the greenfield infrastructure, which by the way, not many guys, at least the invest.
We seem to have lost contact with Manish. Please bear with us for a few minutes.
The national infrastructure pipeline needs some help.
Yeah. Yes.
Execution is going to be the biggest sort of a challenge that the government has to watch out for. And what I mean by that is like this. I mean, if you look at the sectors which has been into play, I mean, right from railways to roads or power. I mean, if you look at the spread, almost railways, roads, and power, energy rather, actually constitute almost 68% of the total $80 billion. That's roughly the spread that the government has come out with. Now, each of these sectors are at a very different level of maturity. I mean, if you take the example of railways, I think a few months back, the government had launched what we call as a PPP in trains, railway trains, in a big sort of a way for the first time. And while there were a lot of interest from industry and the private sector, but ultimately when the bids came in, there were hardly any bids. And I think that's the fundamental flaw that the government has to ensure doesn't happen when they start looking for an execution. The structuring of these projects, the balanced risk reward framework are two important components that the government has to keep in mind if they really want the private sector to put in the capital. So they have surely got an interest of the global capital, domestic pool of capital into this, but getting that actual capital invested would require a couple of key steps and a fundamental changes in the construct as well. I would just go to the extent that it is not just a just not a incremental change. It is a change in the construct itself as well. So if you look at the structuring of a projects, now I think the entire PPP approach that the India has witnessed, I would say that there have been a good successes, but there have been a far greater failures as well. And and personally, I believe that a great work was done by the Kelkar committee under Kelkar committee. I think it is to my mind one of the best work under PPPs that one could have thought through. A lot of practical suggestions and recommendations were given there. Unfortunately, not many has seen the light of the day. So my personal view to the government and the urge is that let's get a fundamental things right. One is the structure part of these projects. Second is we still don't have a commercial dispute resolution independent sort of a body to look at the PPP concessions, commercial issues that crop up over a life of concessions. Now, we are talking of a concession period as long as about 60 years in, let's say, airports, to right from about 20, 25 years to 60 years. Obviously, I mean, an economy like India or any economy for that matter, there would be a lot of commercial issues that will come up between concessionaire and the awarding authority. Today, we don't have, despite the best intentions announced in the budget, we don't have a commercial independent professional body, which is what we have seen in most of the developed worlds at least, that can adjudicate a commercial matters. This is seen in most of the developed worlds at least. Not I'm talking of a litigation or a legal matters. This is a pure commercial issues that crop up in the concessions, which can be actually adjudicated by in a very independent professional manner. If you look at our regulatory structure and regulation and the policy part, I mean, while policy part is fine, but the regulation is also a very important component when you look at the infrastructure sectors. You also need to probably involve regulator. I have been holding a view that if you want some of these PPPs to be successful, when you really look at these concession drafts, you have to involve a sector regulator. If the one exists, if there doesn't exist, you have to actually clear out very clearly. So for example, railways, we don't have a regulator today. You are dealing with an independent, I mean, you will dealing with a monolith like Indian Railways on the other side. And as a private player, my ability to even discuss something, to negotiate something, to get into a situation if I during the concession period and deal with it is actually very limited. And therefore, if you don't have a regulator in the sectors like railways and you want to do a PPP, what's the best way to probably proceed on that line so that you give me a comfort that once I put that capital or a capex over the next 15, 20 years, I mean, that is not going to go down the drain. So the risk reward framework, the transaction structure, your regulatory part in some of the sectors which are not evolved and matured, your PPP framework through Kelkar committee suggestions, independent commercial dispute resolution body are to my mind some of the very fundamental factors that the government needs to really put in place before one can really say that, okay, this will lead to a large amount of a capital actually sort of a flowing in. One last element before I take a pause and we can go to the other co-panelist as such is that if you look at If you look at uh, the entire approach of making these or launching these projects, I strongly feel there is again a revisit required. I strongly feel there is again what is that you offer to the private sector? What is the kind of a feasibility studies that you do? What is the techno-economic viabilities that you do? How do you structure the projects as a DPRs or a feasibility reports? Or the data that you share with the private players before you launch the bid is also extremely important, because the quality of a bid, both from a appetite as well as a pricing, will depend on what you actually share with me as a government authority. And therefore, I strongly believe that there's a strong handholding required by somebody who is more a specialist. Now, whether it is deeper or whether it is Niti Aayog, that's for the government to decide. But you cannot have a situation where you leave these.
Again, we seem to have lost him. Oh, he's back, I think. Okay, I think we can move on to Professor Ram Mohan. And when Manish comes back, we can give him some time to summarize his main points, because I think he was almost at the fag end of his presentation. So I will now welcome Professor Ram Mohan. Professor Ram Mohan is, of course, known to most people in CDS. He was still quite recently Professor of Finance and Economics at Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. And Professor Ram Mohan has done his engineering degrees. Oh, Manish, you are back? Hello?
I don't think we can hear you.
Manish, you have to unmute yourself. I think we cannot. Manish, do you want to summarize your points? We can't hear you. I think there is some connectivity problem. So I think we'll go back to Professor Ram Mohan. So Professor Ram Mohan has done his BTech in metallurgical engineering from IIT Mumbai, and then went on to do an MBA from IIM Calcutta, and then did his PhD in finance from the Stern School of Business at New York University. And of course, he's been working in the area of banking and finance. He writes very regularly in the Economic and Political Weekly, and also in the popular newspapers, etc. And he has several books to his credit. And so a very warm welcome again back to CDS. And so we look forward to your comments on the National Monetization Pipeline.
Thank you, Professor Mani. Always a pleasure to be associated with CDS, and I'm glad to avail of this opportunity to renew my association. I think Manish has given what seemed to me a somewhat upbeat view of asset monetization, although he's been careful to talk about safeguards that will be required, like sectoral regulators, which I think is an appropriate note of caution to sound. Now, let me just quickly split my talk into two parts. One is what you might call the theory of asset monetization, and the second is the execution of asset monetization. And I will argue that between theory and practice, there can be an enormous gulf. it's very hard to argue with asset monetization in theory, because basically what it amounts to is the equivalent of somebody renting their house. So you give your house on rent and collect the rentals. The difference in asset monetization is that you collect the entire rental in advance in the model which is very dominant, but there are models in which the rental can be collected annually as well. So the government basically is doing something like renting out its assets to somebody and using it to raise funds, which can then be used for investing in fresh infrastructure. And uh, so this essentially, the way it has been conceived here, this is about monetizing what they call brownfield assets, assets which have already been created. And you can see the usefulness of this mechanism, because the maximum problem in infrastructure projects is in the construction stage. The construction risk is very high because of problems of land acquisition, environmental clearance, etc. When government handles that part and takes care of that risk and gets a project going and then hands over the asset, it makes it that much easier for a private party to come in. And then the task before us when it comes to investing in infrastructure is fairly enormous. About 111 lakh crore are planned to be invested over the next 5 years, compared to 36 lakhs crore of investment in infrastructure in the 12th five-year plan. So we are contemplating a massive increase in infrastructure investment, out of which 40 to 45% of the financing will come from central and state government, and the rest will come from market borrowings and other sources. And asset monetization will contribute to roughly, they're saying 15 to 20% of the total government expenditure, central and state expenditure that is contemplated. And even this may be an under 15 to 20% of what the government plans to spend is to come from asset monetization. This may be an underestimate given that both central and state government finances are under considerable pressure. And therefore, you can see the utility of a mechanism such as asset monetization. If you have that kind of ambitious plan for infrastructure investment, then asset monetization is going to be a very useful way of financing it. And then the Niti Aayog paper to which Professor Mani alluded, and I think all of you should read the two documents which Niti Aayog has put out. 88-page document, which is basically guidelines, and then a companion document, which is volume 2, which lists the assets which are planned for monetization, gives a very comprehensive picture. So the first volume argues that this is preferable to privatization or even disinvestment, because in the case of disinvestment and privatization, the proceeds go to the government, which may not necessarily use it for investment. It can use it for consumption, spending, or other purposes. Whereas here, because the asset monetization is taking place under the auspices of public sector enterprises or public agencies or government authorities, the proceeds will go to the concerned enterprise or agency, which will then have an incentive to spend it on fresh investment. Of course, in principle, the government can take out some of the money through larger dividend payments by PSUs, but taking out, such enormous sums as dividends will certainly cause a bit of a flutter. So it makes it that much more difficult for the government to lay its hands on these funds. In other words, whatever you're realizing through the monetization of assets, there's a good chance that it will be reinvested in fresh infrastructure assets. And the government has indicated that, rather, Niti Aayog has indicated that about 65 to 70% of the investment is going to have monetization is going to happen from three sectors: power, railways, and roads. So that is the broad picture, or the theoretical position that is envisaged. So it is when you get into the details of execution that you begin to have misgivings about. Just look a little more closely at the two of asset monetization, which Niti Aayog mentions. The first is what is called direct contracting, or the public-private partnership model, and the second is the infrastructure investment trust. So let me take up each of these in turn and tell you a little bit about these models and what are the pros and cons of each. So in public-private partnership or direct contracting, you basically rent out the assets to some private party for a specified period. The period that's generally talked about is something like 25 to 30 years. It's a fairly long period. And after that, the asset comes back to the government. So the government has been very keen to make the point that this is not the sale of an asset. You're just parting with the asset temporarily. But I think the first thought which will come to anybody's mind is that if you return the asset after 30 years, what are the chances that it will be in a good enough condition for future usage? What is the incentive for the private party to spend on maintenance towards the end of the asset so that the asset comes back to the government after 30 years in a reasonably usable condition? And if not, there's not going to be much value left in the asset after such a long period, then does it not amount to sale in effect? So that is, I think, one thought which will immediately come to anybody's mind. The second thing is, the revenue raising effort, which is built into this mechanism. So the government is talking of 6 trillion worth of assets being up for sale, and that's about 5.6% of the total infrastructure investment that is planned. So it's going to offer 6 trillion to private parties, and it's hoping. So this is the value of these assets, estimated value of these assets under government ownership, and the government is hoping that it will get more than 6 trillion when private parties bid for this. Now, how will this happen? First of all, if you're just going to give it to a private party for 6 trillion or less, then clearly government doesn't gain. And the whole point is to be able to get more than 6 trillion by selling it to some. So why will the private party pay more than 6 trillion? I think the immediate answer is that it hopes to have greater operational efficiency in the government, save on operating costs, and generate more surplus. And so the asset is more valuable under private hands. But suppose this doesn't happen. Suppose the private party is not able to operate it more efficiently. So say for 100 crore of asset, it has paid 120 crores, and it assumes that the operating efficiency is going to go up. That's why it's paid 120 crores. If this doesn't happen, then what is the private party going to do? I'm sure the answer suggests itself to you. It's going to raise the price. So supposing there is a road for which you're paying X rupees per usage, it'll go to say 1.2 times X. And so there is a cost in this to the consumer, there's a cost to the economy. So if every transport truck which is going through is going to pay more for usage, there's evidently a cost to the economy. So that's one thing that we have to think about. How do we ensure that the bidding process and the higher prices paid for assets don't translate into a cost to the economy, and that in fact the operational efficiencies are going to be realized? The second point I would make is that even if the operational efficiencies are realized and the private party thinks that it can use the assets more efficiently, that doesn't mean that it can pay more than the 100 crores which the asset is worth. Why? Because the cost of capital for a private party is going to be much higher than for a public authority. Whether you look at first, and there are two reasons for that. One is that a public authority can finance an asset through much lesser equity and greater debt. Being a government authority, it can raise more debt. Second, whatever debt it raises can be cheaper compared to the debt cost for a private authority. And therefore, my point is that even if the operating efficiency is going to go up under private ownership, this can be overwhelmed by the higher cost of capital of the private party, and therefore it may not be able to pay more than 6 trillion for the asset. So if it's a well utilized asset with good traffic flow, etc., then the chances are the private party will be tempted to pay simply 6 trillion less its own return, in which case the government is a clear loser. And my own feeling is that given the desperation to raise finances, the whole issue of valuation will not get the importance that it deserves. And the government may be very keen to dispose of the assets for whatever finances it's going to get. And so you see, this is the danger, that you're going to sell the assets at less than what is the appropriate value. One can go a little deeper into this valuation issues, but I will stop with that and perhaps address it a little more deeply later. Questions come up. Now let me take up the second model, which is the infrastructure investment trust, and this seems to me a far more straightforward model, because basically an infrastructure investment trust is something like a mutual fund where you get to where investors get to investing in a portion of the cash flows which come from any asset. So let's say National Highway Authority is running some asset, so it is able to sell 20, 30, 40% stake to individual investors or institution investors, and you partake of those cash flows, but the public authority remains in the picture. And so the lower cost of capital which the public authority enjoys, that advantage doesn't go away. At the same time, the asset is monetized, and National Highway Authority or Power Grid or whoever, Power Grid Corporation or whoever, is able to realize funds for future investment. So it seems to me that the infrastructure investment trust model is going to be less of a problem in terms of all the issues that I raised than the public private partnership model. But just to conclude very quickly, because I notice I only have a couple of minutes left, I would say that there are two kinds of assets broadly which will be there for monetization. One is assets which are being well utilized, where the cash flows are good, where the demand is good, and I think these kinds of assets should be monetized through the infrastructure investment trust route, because there is no uncertainty associated with the cash flows, and the government or the public authority can very conveniently use the infrastructure investment trust mechanism for monetizing and raising funds for future investment. Where an asset is heavily underutilized or non-utilized, a road which nobody wants to build, a stadium which is lying unused. So these kinds of assets you can offer through the public-private partnership route, so that if they want to come in and invest, so that's going to raise the level and realize operational efficiencies or whatever, then additional investment comes in and there is some incremental advantage to the economy. But I strongly suspect that it is a well-utilized and low-risk assets for which the private investors will have an appetite, and the investors then the assets from which we really gain by going through the public private partnership route will not be the assets that will appeal to private investors. So in short, my friends, the execution of asset monetization is going to be a huge challenge, and I think once a few of these deals happen, especially the PPP kinds of deals, you can hear the war cry of scam going up, and one should not be surprised if consequently consequent to the backlash, things start to slow down dramatically. So the mechanisms that need to be put in place, such as the ones that Manish mentioned, regulator, of course, sectoral regulators or some kind of monitoring authority and all that. First, that homework has to be done before you even embark on this process, and you have to be very clear what sort of asset you want to utilize using which of the two mechanisms which have been identified. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Ram Mohan. I think Manish would like to respond to some of the points, but maybe you could do that once we have completed the first round. So I will now invite Mr. Narayan Ramachandran, who is actually a friend and well-wisher of the center. He is also connected to the center in various ways because his father, the former chief secretary to government of Kerala, was the chairman of our governing body for a long time, And Narayan was also instrumental in helping CDS in the early 2000s to have a link with Stanford Center for International Development. Now, Narayan Ramachandran is also, like Professor Ram Mohan, went to the same IIT Mumbai and did a BTech in chemical engineering. Professor Ram Mohan did a BTech in metallurgical engineering. And like him, he went on to do an MBA, but from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And he's also a chartered financial analyst. Came back, and he was the head of the country head of Morgan Stanley in India for a long time. And these days, he is known for his pioneering work in the area of building an inclusive institutions. And he's the chairman of a social enterprise incubator called Include Labs. And he's also been a banker. He's been the chairman of a private bank called Ratnagar Bank for 2 terms. And 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 so he has a considerable amount, and he's also an angel investor. And I believe nowadays he's also very much interested in encouraging diaspora from the diaspora to invest in India. You know, and so I think he's a man well trained in the area of finance and also in actual practice of finance. Okay, so Narayan, very warm welcome again to CDS, and the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Professor Sunil. Real pleasure to be here. Though I must say, you have to stop inviting Professor Ram Mohan and I together because we risk being in violent agreement with each other all times. So I have to maybe you position this as sort of practitioner, academic practitioner, and otherwise. We'll have to see what the fourth speaker says. But maybe it is optimist, pessimist, pessimist, and then optimist again. So you'll have to bear with me on this one. I thought I'll take a slightly different way to approach this problem, and I will start by wearing my persuasion on my sleeve, so you know where it's coming from. So my persuasion is that markets are the least imperfect way to allocate capital and perform most services. They are imperfect, but they're the least imperfect way. I say this with some trepidation to an audience that is mostly in Trivandrum, but regardless, that is my position. Markets require clearly defined rules and work best when there is competition. The government has a very important role, and that is to ensure fair play and enforce against misuse. In a rare moment, government will need to step in to address market failure. Okay, so that's the umbrella with which I will will address this issue, and in that sense, I think I'm very broadly similar to what Professor Ram Mohan also said. But let me begin with a general example and a specific example, and then I'll go to what I call the good, bad, and the ugly of the National Monetization Plan. I was hoping I could play the theme song from Clint Eastwood, but Sunil, that's for another day. So the general example is as follows. Let's say there is a fellow, let's call him husband, and he has an asset that he's running it poorly. Husband decides to get married and acquire and together husband and wife get married. And so husband decides to come up with a great idea and says, dear wife, here is an asset that I've been running suboptimally. It is your asset to use, but please generate some return. And unusually for us, I'm going to take a fair amount of money right up front from you. Right? We know of lots of weddings nowadays in the diaspora in Silicon Valley where there are prenups, but this particular marriage is going to be slightly different. It's going to be a post-nup. The post-nup is after 25 years or so, you have to return my asset to me. And in this post-nup, this pre-arranged divorce, we will exist for the period of our defined marriage. Now, to make it spicier, let's add some in-laws. We will add on the one side, we will add the CAG and the CVC, which are the Vigilance Commission and the Accountant General's Office. And on the other side, we can add errant children who drive luxury cars at night on some illegal substance. So now we have got the full picture. This is exactly the picture that you have in the translation of the theory to the practice that Professor Ram Mohan talked about, which is on the face of it, it may be a very good idea because recall we started with husband running asset poorly. But when it comes down to the actual institutional structure, particularly when the institutions are weak and the policing of those institutions is a complicated societal hierarchy, then we get into all kinds of trouble with the asset. Let's take a specific example now from the generalized example and think of the Bangalore airport. And let's just say, for argument's sake, that the government had built the Bangalore airport. They did not. But the government, for instance, built the Chennai airport, and you can already see the difference. But let's just say the Bangalore airport was built by the government. And now the concession for the next 30 years is being given to a private sector player. Now, let's say Bangalore Airport, as it already is at capacity, and somebody needs to build the extra hub for a few more airlines to come in and go out. You can just imagine the discussion of sort of a standard business problem that shows up between government now and the private sector in this context, discussing, how will it be built, what will be the size, will there be a VIP room for people who don't pay anything that is bigger than the other VIP room, and so on, right? So there will be a whole discussion. So this is the institutional context of all public-private partnerships. By the way, the word National Monetization Pipeline appears to me just politically, what should I call it, inert word relative to public-private partnership. For all practical purposes, it is a structured way to conduct a public-private partnership. And because PPP has all kinds of connotations, politically, they have introduced this word called NMP, which, by the way, is meant to dovetail into the National Infrastructure Pipeline. For those of you who don't remember, that was launched a year and a half ago towards the end of 2019 with a equally long list. So let me tell you what I think is the good about this. As exactly as Professor Ram Mohan said, nobody can really quarrel with the idea of the conceptual idea of taking an asset and making it useful. Particularly the ideal asset. Ideal is the wrong word here because the Niti Aayog has carefully specified that there is a separation of ideal assets from underutilized assets. So ideal assets are meant to be sold, and underutilized assets. Now they introduce another word called core, which I'm still unclear about the semantic distinction between underutilized core and idle core or non-core. So there will be some question marks around all of these, but for a moment, if we just go with the idea that these are core assets that are underutilized, then there is some merit, certainly some merit in saying that society should draw more value from this. There is clearly some thinking that has gone through into identifying, what assets might work here and might not work, and so on. So at least there is an attempt at clarity, even if it is not ultimately totally clear. As Professor Ram Mohan mentioned, I think it also signals an emphasis on investment versus consumption, which this government in various ways has been signaling. So even in their budgets, relative to say UPA2, for instance, there has been an emphasis on investments over consumption. And I think this is a welcome step, particularly in the absence of private sector investment to catalyze GDP growth in India. I think this is a very welcome. So these are the good aspects of this plan. So the theory is good. The general thinking about it is, I think, the right start. The emphasis on investment is the right signal. Let me get to what I think is the bad element of this. The bad element of this is we have actually we have upgraded, but the upgrade is bad enough. The National Infrastructure Pipeline was a PowerPoint document. The National Monetization Pipeline is a PDF document. So, I mean, you will see the real irony in this when we talk about lakhs and lakhs of crores being represented in PowerPoints and PDFs with little follow through in terms of what happens with all of this. As you know, the NIP was created by secretaries with no help from Niti Aayog in a couple of weeks over Christmas 2 years ago. And it reflected that complete lack of rigorous thinking. It was just a collation exercise of a PowerPoint. But the Niti Aayog has done a good job and produced 88 pages of PDF. I would definitely recommend that we all read it. So there is a conceptual positive to what Niti Aayog has done. The Niti Aayog also has done reasonably good work on the structures of transfer. Some of you who know the old Planning Commission will know, they used to publish these models of public-private trust. One of the stalwarts in that area was a guy called Gajendra Haldia. So sort of following on that model, they have published structures that would work for these asset transfers. And I would generally say, with the qualifications that Professor Ram Mohan mentioned, the financial structuring is reasonably well thought through. What is completely unthought through is the institutional structures. And we can talk about it more in Q&A, but I would tell you that all of the problems that both Manish and Professor Ram Mohan identified are here. Another bad thing is that we are not entirely sure what are they trying to solve. Are they solving the problem of underutilized assets? Are they solving the problem of generating some surplus? What exactly are we trying to solve? Because if you're trying to solve the problem of creating funding for an infrastructure pipeline, there are many ways to do it. And even at its most optimistic, this is 5 to 15%. So we can do with it, we can do without it. It's not that material to the overall thing if we end up not using this method. So there are many structures that are possible. There are tranching structures where you give seniority to sovereign investors and so on. I mean, I don't know whether some of you heard the videos that came out of Niti Aayog and from Nitin Gadkari and others. They were all talking repeatedly about Canadian pension plans and sovereign funds. Canadian pension plans and sovereign funds are quite okay with a government guarantee of an IRR. They don't need to be involved at the level of actually replumbing the infrastructure asset in order to generate 7% IRR that they are looking for, or 8% IRR that they're looking for. And last but not least, on the bad, I will get to the ugly, we haven't got to it yet, is that there is no mention of exactly the talent that will run this. Now, it's possible that the private sector will be allowed to fully make independent decisions, but it's possible that it's not either. So if there is constant interference on pricing, on upgrade capital allocation, on who can be hired, who cannot be hired, it's a little bit like Indian Institute of Science trying to compete in the world with a salary structure that is borrowed from the government of India. So what talent will you get at what price, and who is allowed to make the decision on the talent is completely unclear in the Niti Aayog's definition of this private-public partnership. Let me get to the ugly. The ugly, Professor Ram Mohan hinted at it, but I will use only one word. The risk, if this is halfway successful, the ugly aspect of this is that it will end up in what I call a bigopoly. The bigopoly is my definition of the word bigopoly is big companies will create oligopoly with complete compliance from government, which could potentially result in asset stripping. The flip side of that is very small victories, in which case it was an irrelevant program anyway. So in my view, the NMP, the translation between theory and practice will doom its success. It will actually be successful if it is small, but if it is small, then it's small. So I'll conclude with that.
Okay, Narayan, that was spot on time, and thank you so much. Now I think we have the last speaker for the day, which is Professor R. Nagaraj. Professor Nagraj is currently a visiting professor here at the Center for Development Studies. And prior to that, he was for over 3 decades a professor at the Indira Gandhi Institute for Development Research. His PhD in economics and MPhil in economics both are from the Center for Development Studies through, of course, the degrees are from JNU. And before that, he did his 5-year integrated master's in economics from BITS Pilani. Now, Professor Nagaraj has been writing about these issues for a fairly long period of time. And and he has a piece on the National Monetization Pipeline in the Hindu, just like Professor Ram Mohan also had one. And so, Nagaraj, the floor is yours. You could take about 15 minutes. Yeah. Nagaraj, you have to unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I will upload my, just a minute, I'll upload my presentation.
You see the share button on your
Yeah.
yeah.
I've done that. share. Can you see me? Can you see the?
Yeah, we can see.
Can I make it full screen? Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Sunil. This is I start with some very basics, very simple economics. I think somehow we seem to forget those things. That's why I'm starting there. MNP, a form of privatization. That's, I think other speakers have also said the same thing. I don't have to go. There can be various kinds of privatizations, full sale of with change in control and management control, lease of an enterprise, or partial sale of, which is also called disinvestment, or lease of a productive asset or enterprise. There can be enormous combinations of it. So to claim that NMP is different from disinvestment and privatization it doesn't really hold, as other speakers have said. So, okay, the underlying idea is that is to combine government's ability to raise large resources and build public assets, and to run the businesses efficiently with the private sector's professional ability. That's I'm trying to get the best of both worlds. Seems to be the underlying idea, which is true of many such earlier efforts. We know one can go back in time, say mid 1960s, we started joint ventures to overcome the power of private monopolies. Then we had PPP, disinvestment, and so on. Okay, so therefore it is not a new idea. We have had various versions of it. That's the first point. Why public ownership? Again, it sounds like an economics 101, but worth maybe mentioning this. You have public goods, which are non-rival, non-excludable. Okay, now then you have the market failure argument, externalities. Then you have natural monopolies, which is very important in public goods, which we often forget. Natural monopolies, merit goods, you know what merit goods are, and then public bad. Very often you have public bad. And strategic or national interest is something which often comes in, which we overlook. So this is something. It's important to mention these basic reasons why you have public interest. Okay. Local natural monopolies and public services are usually leased or contracted out. Privatization, local monopolies, which is a very common thing happens. In fact, if you think of called leasing out the toll bridges or parking lots, it happens throughout the world. I think only in Kerala I have seen even the parking lots are run by police departments, but most other places one sees they're contracted out. Okay. Maybe Kerala government has its own reasons for doing it, but so therefore, even as simple a thing like a parking lot or they can be run purely as a departmental, the government department, or it can be contracted out. Okay, so problem comes when natural monopolies, public goods have strong externalities. This is important, and network economics and technology standards and strategic considerations. So this is what makes large public investments different from small parking lots or toll bridges or weighing bridges. And we are talking about these large public monopolies or public goods, which underlie the public capital. So this is something which we need to keep in mind. Okay. Again, continuing the government ownership, in principle, sound regulation and effective contract enforcement can substitute for public ownership. And this is something which, the contract theory scholars will tell that it all depends on how well a contract can be written. But of course, you know that no contract can take care of all eventualities. That's a very important given. And secondly, often the problem comes of contracts enforcement, especially in a poor country and a country like India, where contract enforcement is very poor. We have seen in the case of IPC, which was started a few years ago, but did not take off very much. So enforcing contracts is very hard. Okay, that's very important in a developing country. Okay. These are easy to enforce for small localized services. like I mentioned about parking lots, because the externalities are very limited, the costs and benefits are fairly easily measurable. So I think the such contracts have little, not too much of a problem. But you'll have problems if you think of privatizing, say, VT station in Bombay. I mean, there are enormous externalities associated with it. It has connections with almost every sector of the economy. Okay, so how are you going to write the contracts and how are you going to enforce them? So therefore, unless you have those, what could happen is that the lots of equity considerations which are assumed under public ownership will get abolished practically, or will be undermined. So that's a big if, which is okay. Often time frames or national requirements or development mandates compel public ownership. This is important. Why public ownership is coming to being, even in some very trivial things, because of national mandates, where markets are not functioning all right, where the speed of doing things are very important. Public sector ownership comes into play. Okay. Those are two basics of ideas of privatization. Okay, is my NMP different? Not very much. Government has carefully avoided using the term privatization and disinvestment, as the previous speaker said. I mean, it's basically a marketing technique of selling the idea. The government has sought to give NMP a positive spin to raise resources for fresh investment, not for bridging fiscal deficit. Again, this is a spin. You know that a simple idea. Any person who knows finance, money is fungible. Okay, therefore, this is not a big deal. But this is how the government has sought to communicate to the public. NMP seeks to lease out revenue earning public capital, hoping to improve upon return on investment. This is important in the sense, as previous speaker said, most of these are revenue earning. In fact, they are earning revenue right now, and the government is only hoping to improve the earnings, barring a few completely dead assets. But by and large, most of the items in NMP are revenue earning. Surely there must be scope for improving the returns and plugging the wastage. But they are not dead assets. They are okay. So unlike in the earlier case when privatization was initially sought for assets which were not performing well, or which are making losses. Okay, I mean, no change in ownership, but to bring about private sector efficiency. The efficiency of the private sector into public assets management. Okay, we know that in a modern economy, ownership has a very complex connotation. I mean, you can have ownership and control, ownership of all kinds of ownership. Okay, partial ownership. So therefore, I think it's not like, we cannot think of it like a street corner shop. That ownership is held by an individual or of a particular family. In a modern complex world economy, ownership of a private sector enterprise is extremely complex. So therefore, how ownership change is likely to affect the distribution of profits or distribution of gains is extremely difficult to be a priori to be sure about. Okay, so are there arguments for MNP sound? Probably not. This is my purely in terms of idea. Is the ideas behind the NMP right? It doesn't seem to be the case as far as I can read. Okay. Then past experience. I know I don't want to go into the microeconomics of it, which others speakers have talked about. Let me just talk about our own experience. What has happened during the last 2 decades? 1991 reforms introduced disinvestment for the first time. Until then, public sector was a holy cow, which was never thought to be disinvested. It is to remain fully with government. So 91 reforms brought in the concept of disinvestment. That is the sale of a small proportion of PSU shares in the booming stock market. Idea was just to remind readers, the listeners, that the stock market was booming. The government offloaded shares to UTI in some bundles. And those bundles were supposed to be sold in the stock market when the stock market was booming, and take advantage of the boom. Okay, But unfortunately, this process could not go very long because Harshad Mehta's scam erupted and dashed the government's hopes of realizing large revenues. And not only that, that scam had such a severe effect for the almost entire decade of the 1990s. Very little money could be mobilized by this investment because the idea of a stock market based raising resources got completely discredited at that time. However, in 1999, when NDA government came to power, they thought of privatizing, but again, the privatization was seen as a not so acceptable word. So they used the term strategic sale. The idea was to sell about 30% of equity of selected enterprises to private enterprises or private business houses. It's a bulk sale. It's a sale of not a retail sale. And idea was to mobilize resources for the government to reduce fiscal deficit. Allegations of corruption are abound. Even today, if one goes back and reads, there's an enormous amount of literature on it. And those of us who have visited Bombay or lived there, we know the Center Hotel in Bombay Airport and one in the Juhu is a living example of how things can go wrong with privatization. So even to this date, Center Hotel remains a dead asset. It's completely unworkable. It's completely shut. Because of the disputes involved. In all these cases, land was not factored in. This is very interesting. I mean, despite having the best possible consultants from with global expertise, when they were selling these assets, they did not include land, which is a sure source for quick buck to be made and huge corruption possibility. Okay, and this is exactly what happened. I mean, just to give a very brief with 2 sentences, what happened? Centaur Hotel was sold for some 20 crore rupees, and next week it was sold for 80 crore rupees. And the person who bought it made a clean profit of some 60 crores in 2 weeks time. Okay, so that kind of very blatant corruption was possible. Okay. Overall, revenue proceeds are insignificant share of fiscal deficit. This is important. Okay. However, fast forward to 2010s, disinvestment proceeds are significantly higher. In fact, I just calculated it's about 60% of the targeted amount was realized. I don't have the figure as a percentage of the fiscal deficit, but 60% of budgeted disinvestment were realized. But there is a problem here. Most of the disinvestments were within the government setup. In fact, it was not a sale from public to private, but within public sector network. And therefore, it was basically intended to raid cash-rich PSUs to bridge fiscal deficit with little efficiency considerations. If you recall, LIC was made to buy assets of many disinvestment transactions. I think, one can multiply the examples. I think I'm running short of time. So therefore, this is the experience. Global record with privatization has been very mixed, to put it mildly. I mean, there's a whole lot of literature, very contentious literature. But if one honestly, without looks at closely, the experience is very mild. Again, widespread corruption in sale of enterprises is endemic. The discrediting policy you take from Eastern Europe to Brazil, you have very serious corruption cases. Okay, UK, the cradle of privatization experience, is seriously considering putting the clock back. A unanimous agenda of both political parties. This was revealed in last year's election. Even the Conservative Party wants to renationalize the railways, which are privatized by Thatcher. However, privatization of municipal services, garbage collection, parking lot, user charge, etc., which happened mostly in the US, seems to have shown better results. Okay, in UK, in strategic industries, often de facto government control has been retained by ingenious regulations such as golden share. I mean, in critical industries like British Petroleum and British Airways, UK government has a golden share, which it can use if there is a takeover threat from non-UK enterprises. Okay, so effectively the government control or public national ownership is retained. That's that's how cleverly the contract was designed. Okay, okay. Alternative method. This is what I have written in my op-ed recently. If NNP's main purpose is to raise resources quickly for fresh investment, as the budget stated, why not borrow from the capital market? And the real cost of debt today is negative. And just to give you a figure, cost of central government borrowing last year was 5.8%, whereas the consumer price index was 6.2%. These are all RBI numbers. So you have a clean advantage of 0.4%. You have a negative interest rate at which you can borrow. Okay, inflation fear is limited as of now with surfeit of liquidity in the market. There are no takers of credit in the market. Okay, industry suffering from excess capacity, wages are down for lack of employment. I mean, these figures are widely available. So the fear of government stepping up investment will lead to inflation is very modest in the medium term, as far as I can see. Government can also borrow from the central bank, what is called the debt monetization, or in the old-fashioned way, we used to call it deficit financing. Okay, as a last resort. And in fact, much of the world has done this during the pandemic. India is probably one of the few countries, or probably the only country, which has not done it, or done it in extremely small fashion. Okay, so this shows how conservative, economically conservative, the present government has been. Okay, even the British government, British conservative government, has been borrowing from the central bank. Okay, so such borrowing is a wholesale business between the central bank and the government, or from the financial market and the government. So the risk of corruption and cronyism, which we all know about, is minimal. I'll stop here. Just to sum up, NNP is in essence the same as privatization and disinvestment. The underlying idea are the same: seek to marry the advantages of public ownership with supposed operational efficiency of private sector. What is the ideology behind it? Since the government has no business to be the government. My feeling is the present government is largely driven by this agenda. Okay, behind all the rhetoric of and I suppose this is in line with Prime Minister Modi's grand announcement in 2014 election: minimum government and maximum governance. I think that seems to be the underlying idea behind this. Okay, cheaper and efficient alternatives exist. That is debt demonetization, available with excess liquidity in the market. Real danger of NNP is public loss. If it is a fire sale, I think again previous speakers mentioned about it. If there's a fire sale because government revenues are in bad shape, okay, then I think it's a net loss to the government and private gain with little raise in infrastructure investment. That's my feeling. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nagraj. Okay, there seems to be remarkable consensus among the 4 panelists. I was expecting the industry people to be a little bit more in terms of taking the knives out of the bags.
Sunil, it is not. Sunil, it is not. I would like to come in some of the misconceptions being laid out. So
okay.
I'm waiting for making some interventions.
Okay, okay, okay. So I think I will now let Manish, take his knives out of the bag. Okay.
Okay, I think, we are living in some misconceptions which is carrying on for the decades, and we want to continue with that sort of misconceptions as well. Let me take one by one. I don't know what is wrong about the ideology to say that the government should not be in the business of running business. I think the fundamental philosophy which we have actually sort of makes sense, and for a country like India, which is at a stage where we are. Point number one. Point number two, I think we are under impression and believe that the private sector should be offered something which is a deadwood, or something which is not a revenue earning, or something which is under construction. And they will actually take all the risk, come over in the Indian sort of a context where they will have a land acquisition issues, or let's say a pre-development cycle, continue with the government approval process for 7-8 years. And that's what the private sector is good for. And as far as moment you come to a brownfield assets, revenue earning assets, that is something the government should keep with themselves. Point number 4, I think the alleged corruption and the potential to have a corruption, something cannot be used as a narrative to stop moving ahead or do a strategic disinvestment, privatization, or the sale process. I mean, that sort of a thing can happen in any sort of a context. And it is like saying that as if the government is the owner of these assets, there is no corruption there. So I think the corruption part is a baseline. I don't see that as if the corruption moving from the public sector to a private sector is something, I mean, that takes the corruption care of, and there's no corruption that happens in the public sector. On the contrary, there are examples to different. I think if we look at some of the last misconception is that government keep raising debt because the debt is available, and this debate actually happened over multiple economists, Indian as well as foreigners as well during the COVID times, when I think what was being pushed to the government very hard was that why should we not raise debt and use that money to, let's say, pay off the people, or let's say, I mean, spend in the expenditure as well. So I think I strongly believe that there are 4 or 5 things that we need to really keep in mind here. First of all, I think as long as you design, and I think Professor raised some very good points, Professor Rao raised very good points. I mean, when you deliver these assets over a concession period, these concession terms stipulate what are the service standards you have to deliver. That's point number 1. And obviously, you can talk about, and I agree, what is the enforcement level that we have that can be actually made more tighter. But there are service standards that laid down. Second, when you return these assets, what are the condition of these assets is also very clearly laid down as well. So it's not that I can run down the asset for 25 years and I give it back. Second, when you run these assets for 20, 25 years, you just cannot run it without having a further capex. I mean, you take examples of airports, you take examples of roads, there's a major maintenance every 5 years, there is a capex laid down. At moment your PCU hits a particular number, you have to go for a 4-laning to 6-laning, etc. So there are enough safeguards that is sort of a built-in. Point number 3, I think very fair point again was mentioned that, let's say, in my sort of a thing, I bid for an asset which is higher as a number, and later on to make up for that, I can increase the tariffs. Actually, it is not. And that's why I actually brought out upfront the need for a regulator. If you look at the highway concessions, it is not that the concessionaire can increase the traffic and the toll rates actually just because he's not making money. We have seen so much of a stress in the road sector, and there's no freedom. It is a laid down formula which actually determines what is the toll rates, and that is same for NHI or, let's say, the private sector as well. So I think the process to step back is all about, you can't raise debt to actually fund your infrastructure like this. I mean, because there's a crowding of, in fact, there is a private markets. Those capital markets are to be used for a lot of other money as well. Second, I think the government raising debt to do this is not a great idea. I mean, in these assets, you are not raising the debt, you are taking the money up front. A private investor is coming in, taking a risk for a 30, 40 years, and therefore this entire misconception that it is just a operating road, there is no sort of a private sector is not taking any risk, is a complete myth. I mean, I am giving you money upfront for 40 years, 30 years, without knowing actually that how the asset will pan out, what the traffic will actually flow. Tomorrow there could be a catchment area which can change, and that is what we have seen in the private sector. Look at what happened and what was a Delhi and Mumbai airport before privatization. Not even having good toilets to go for. Forget about anything else. And today, look at what these airports are. So I think we have to just look at this program in a different lens. That same old lens to say that a public sector, you are selling a fire sale, you're selling a crown jewel, I think don't apply. First of all, it is not a fire sale. You have to understand that the basic principle of government being not in the running the business of airports or highways, as long as you measure the security structures in the critical sectors, I think that's a fundamental business principle where the capital flows in. Second, you have to have a regulator which has a job to ensure the competitive efficiency of a sector, and there's a competitive intensity of a sector is maintained with the consumer standards. So you will always have a regulator which will say that you can't have a consumer tariff increasing or a user charges increasing in many of these sectors just because somebody wants to increase that. And the last point I would also make a point here is that if you really want investments to sort of come in, um, which I don't think, I mean, here anybody's disputing that we don't need a foreign capital, we don't need a long-term FDI investment. These are the long-term FDI investments. When we did a first TOT, for example, and the point was made about the reserve price underselling the assets. The reserve price, whatever was set up, I mean, the value discovery was almost like 1.5 times. Most of these assets are funded by the government as their own money. So once the private capital comes in, they get into a leverage structure, capital structure, and therefore they bring in some efficiencies, plus some of the returns actually play out differently. So I think all in all, I would say that I still believe, and I hold a view which I said, that execution part has lot many more challenges, which are more on an institutional structure side, on the regulatory sort of a side, on the way these projects are being awarded for the process side. But the conceptually, I mean, to say that you should not have an NMP and this is like selling a fire sale, I don't subscribe to that view. I think this is high time that India should have said that, look, this is the sectors we don't need to be in the government for a business. Let's the private sector come in with both efficiencies as well as the capital, which is the long-term capital, because some of these sovereign capital funds have a capital which can be actually for 30, 40 years. And therefore, if it is actually done well, executed well, it can be a great reform. So I will stop here, Sunil, and happy to have some questions towards that.
Okay, thank you, Manish. I think before I ask the panelists to respond, maybe I will, given the limited time that's available, I will first request anyone from the floor who would like to ask a question, and thereafter I will request the other panelists to respond to Manish.
Um, Professor Sunil,
Yes, please
a
go on.
brief question. Thank you, panelists, for the excellent discussion. It was very good. I have a brief question. In fact, Professor Nagaraj in his presentation, towards the end of his presentation, he spoke about possible alternatives available to the government, like the debt route, public debt route. I would like to hear about the same thing from the first two panelists. Mr. Narayanan and Professor Ram Mohan. Because now in this discussion we focus mainly on the national monetization pipeline. Now, infrastructure investment must take place. What are the possible alternatives, and why we are not thinking about conventional alternatives? I would like to get the response from these two panelists. Of course, the other person had already responded. That's why.
Dr. Ramon, you want to go first?
Oh, yes, okay, please.
Yeah, so I think the question being asked is when the government has the capacity to borrow, why do you need to resort to something like asset monetization? Well, there are different streams open to the government, and certainly the government is doing its fair share of borrowing. And I thought the complaint was that, at least from the rating agencies, is that the government is sort of more or less borrowed up to the hilt at this point, and they're being very kind to us by not downgrading us. So, I mean, given that we are pretty close to a downgrade or not far from rating downgrade or not far from it, I think any new source of revenue would be welcome. And so similarly, you can ask, when the tax revenues are open to the government, why should they not try to improve tax efficiency, and why should they resort to non-tax revenue such as disinvestment, privatization, and asset monetization? But I think there is room for additional revenue streams. That is my short answer.
Yeah, I have to, on this note alone, agree with Manish completely. I think in the present circumstance, it's a bad idea to do debt monetization. I think, as you probably know, we've gone from public debt at 65% of GDP to public debt at 90% of GDP. This is not good for a young country, developing country, because as we grow older, this will grow naturally anyway. As you know, some of the other countries are already at 100+% of GDP in terms of public debt. But those are countries who have sort of gone through their development cycle where the working age population as a percentage of the total population is lower. whereas India's is the still heavily centered on what is called the authorities in demographics. So if the pandemic had not happened, I think we could have said 10-15% debt monetization was a possibility. And like most questions in India, the answer would have been all of the above, which means you do a little bit of everything because you really need a little bit of everything. But given that the pandemic occurred and we have expanded the debt as a percentage of GDP to the extent that we have, I think it's a bad idea. But there are many alternatives. One of them that I was suggesting, which is essentially the sovereign funds come into a structure for greenfield assets, and that is levered with international capital. You can lever it with Japan capital, which is also at 0% rate. So government can finance those, and government can put in a little bit of equity money, but it can essentially provide the guarantees. Now, of course, there is an issue of timing and clearances and so on, but you can't say that government will perform perfectly in the NMP and imperfectly in a greenfield project. Either it performs imperfectly in both, which is most likely, or it will perform, perfectly in both. You can only make those two assumptions. I don't know why it would perform imperfectly in one and perfectly in the other. So I think there are many clever structures to fund greenfield projects where the clarity of the contract is much better than setting it up in a brownfield project with issues of valuation that Professor Ram Mohan mentioned. But for instance, specifically identified infrastructure on a greenfield or almost greenfield basis, it is definitely financeable using dollar capital from sovereign funds. Airports as an example, and airports are being financed completely in the private sector. So you can essentially do an entire package of airports, which even reduces the risk further. So, or small minor ports, as we call them in India, even though minor ports are rather major in India, as you know. I'll stop with that.
Okay, thank you. What about Nagraj? Nagraj, would you like to respond to the debt monetization part?
Okay, thank you, Sunil. I know this is a view which has not been widely accepted in India yet. See, this is I mean, I think one needs to see what's been happening in economic discussion in the US, how the public opinion has changed, how the professional opinion has changed. Okay, and also, okay, forget about that. You see, the basic argument is, look, if the debt is in domestic currency, okay, the cost is low, and you can always finance it by printing money. If worst comes to worst, okay, and as long as the debt is used for investment, in fact, that's what the NMP is supposed to be used for investments. Okay, there's supposed to be, it is, if that is the case, then I don't see any reason why we cannot use it. Okay, that's the first point. Secondly, the question of the cost of debt will be definitely low. Okay, see, dollar cost. In fact, some speaker mentioned previously that the government, when it's tried to borrow from Canadian pension funds, they are planning $7% rate of interest. Okay, imagine what will be the cost of the capital in Indian rupee terms. Think about it. Exchange rate where fluctuations. Okay, given that, okay, and most of the investment is physical infrastructure construction, where most of the requirements is available domestically. Okay, and these are not the ones which are going to give you dollar revenues. See, if you're borrowing in dollars and getting revenue in dollars, then it makes sense. Otherwise, it's a simple common sense to say, look, as if your revenue streams, if your billing is in rupees and if your debt is in dollars, you have a problem. This is a simple economics. Okay, and let me talk about the size of the debt. India has been, I agree, the debt has increased during the last 1 year, obviously because the revenues have fallen. And even, by the way, the government debt has increased, but total expenditure as a percentage of GDP has not gone up, unlike most other countries. I mean, I would reiterate in saying, I mean, I can give evidence later on if necessary. Okay, public expenditure or government expenditure as a percentage of GDP has not increased. Even in foreign investment, investment increased by 0.4%. There's a lot made out about it, but not very much. Okay, so therefore, the government has been very conservative. I agree the debt level has gone up, but it's mostly domestic. Okay, domestic debt is not a problem. And let me give you, I mean, see, uh, Japan has been having 250% of GDP debt. Okay, for 4 decades. Italy, even before it joined the EU, it got into Euro currency. From 1960 to 1992, before it became part of Euro, had more than 100% GDP. And by the way, Italy was one of the poorer countries within Europe, and it had, okay, but it always borrowed as long as people, domestic investors, or say citizens, have trust in your own currency. Okay, and there is no problem of raising money. The only consideration is inflation. Inflation is a problem, and let me tell you, India is not. And I know the typical standard answer, is look. You think of Zimbabwe, you think of Venezuela. No, India has never been a high inflation country. Track this last 7 decades of inflation. You will not find more than 10 years of double-digit inflation. India's inflation rate has never crossed 20%, even for a year. Okay, therefore, I think let's be realistic. And as long as domestic debt is used for productive purpose, it has always been, it's always, there's nothing hard. Only thing one has to watch out is inflation. Okay, that's my take. And this goes back to the old, Dahmer principle. As long, instead of bothering about the numerator, the debt, if you think about the denominator, how to expand the denominator, that is GDP, okay, then your problem is solved. And that can be done if the government borrowing is used for productive purpose. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Nagraj. There is one question in the chat box which a student has asked, and I think this is this question is for Manish, and because he says that when government is in the business of regulation, like you say that you have you privatize something and you put a very effective regulator in place, and then the problems of monopolies, etc., and bad behavior by the private sector is solved. Okay, but he says that it's good to have government monopolies because government monopolies are the best regulator.
See, I think, I mean, this debate, to my mind, is a never-ending debate that whether a government monopoly is a better or a private monopoly is better. And obviously, I mean, I personal view tends to be agreeing to the point that the private monopolies are not really great in that sort of a sense. Having said that, if you look at, let's say, I think the UK example was given, you have an Australia example as well. I think they have been probably my mind, the far more leaders as far as infrastructure is concerned and how they actually mobilize the capital to flow in the quality of infrastructure that they have built in over the years. So they're both examples. I mean, and that will always be the case in anything that you do. My point again is that this entire debate of public and the private is relevant on the key sectors. You have to define the areas where the government needs to be there. It cannot vacate that space. To my mind, that space is not your hard infrastructure. That space is your social infrastructure, your education, your healthcare, your hospitals. I think that's a space the government needs to take care of, and that's where the money needs to be spent by the government. Because you are actually trying to get the benefits to the last denominator who is standing in the queue. But if you really look at the sectors like, I mean, the roads or the ports or the airports, with the efficient regulator, which is taking care of what? Ultimately, the regulator is taking care of two things. One, the sector actually to a state of how do I say? I mean, in terms of a mess. There is a competitive intensity, and second, from a consumer end point of view, I mean, your services are delivered and there is an affordable sort of a charge. That's the job of a regulator. And obviously, it is also maneuvering that the both private and the public sector can coexist without one being at the cost of the another. So I think, I mean, as long as the government is actually into the space and the sectors which it needs to be, and the private can actually, everything else, I can hand it over to the private sector. I'm not saying that the private sector always is great. But by that logic to say that, okay, there are 10, 20%, 30% failures doesn't mean that you keep everything in the government side. is the question that I'm trying to make. And the regulator is something which is must, not only just from a government sector or protecting the consumer, but also to look at the point of a view of a private sector as well. That the government monolith, for example, I give an example of railways. I mean, if Indian Railways are the ones who are going to award these projects, which is listed down in the National Monetization Pipeline, they are the ones that have to deal on the commercial basis. They are the one who are going to own the tracks, for example. I, as a private sector, will think twice whether I need to come into that sector or not. And if you really want that particular sector to have a private investment, you need to have a regulator who is up and running and an efficient regulator who can give me a comfort that, okay, my capital will not go down the drain. Because mind you, the most of the models that we have so far seen is a large upfront money. Like in highways, in the TOT, you're giving me everything upfront. And therefore, I'm walking into the risk what happens next, and then how it pans out over the next 20 years.
Thank you, Manish. Now, there is again one more question from Gayatri. Gayatri, would you like to ask that question yourself? Because I think it looks like a very long one.
Sure, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, so I want to know what the possible impact of NMP would be from a customer point of view. So during the time of bid, are we going to lay out conditions like regarding the higher possible user charges and all of that?
Who wants to answer this?
Can attempt, and I mean,
Yes.
anybody can come in. Yeah. So I think, I mean, different sectors, we have seen a different sort of play, Gayatri. I mean, if you really look at, let's say, the recent one, which didn't work out, as I said, it is a failure on the part of the government, which is PPP in trains. Now, what the government is saying here is that you have a flexibility to determine what's the tariff you will charge a customer or a passenger who is traveling in a train. Now, the fact is that if I have on that track or a route, you have Rajdhanis, for example, and the express trains as well running, you automatically know that if I go beyond Rajdhani fare, you will not have enough demand or a catchment area as well. So while it is a freedom which is given, but my audience and the target that I'm targeting actually doesn't sort of hit or hurt much more. If you look at the airports or let's say roads has a very laid down sort of policy which is being followed by both private as well as the government NHI as well, that how the toll rates can increase. It's a very linked formula. It is not dependent on how much I bid, what returns I have to make. It's a very inflation sort of a determined index that is being laid down. If you look at the airports, I mean, you again have a regulator, which is economic authority ERA as a regulator, and you determine as to what's the tariff or the charges that you can charge for. So I think different sectors are in a different level of maturity, and therefore there is a tariffs or the user charges which is laid down basis, I mean, what the regulatory space that they're operating.
Yeah, I might just add that in a modern economy, it's difficult to. This will be one of the biggest areas of dispute. Back to my husband and wife example, this will be one of the biggest areas of dispute because, for instance, if you say in certain segments, you need to do surge pricing. And let's say that was not fully anticipated, the structure of surge pricing in the contract. That will end up in a loop. And there is no contractual way to resolve those kind of loops in any time-bound manner. So the absence of contractual specification potentially leads to inflation. The presence of contractual specifications potentially leads to rigidity, which is why the practical translation of a theoretical good idea is a very difficult one.
Thank you, Narayan. Anyone else would like to ask any questions? Because we have almost reached 5 o'clock. And what about any, Professor Ram Mohan, would you like to say the last word and before we close for the day?
Well, I think we're pretty well covered in terms of crucial points that needed to be made. So the whole point is, I think, of course, the user charge is one issue. And I think the second and most important issue, which some of us have already highlighted, is the valuation part. And if you look at our experience, whether it is privatization, which we've attempted, or even the auctions which have happened under the auspices of the IBC, the NCLT, you really don't have many situations where the conditions for an efficient auction are met. The conditions for an efficient auction are many, but one very important condition is multiplicity of bidders. And so this important condition is seldom met. So you take Air India. So you go on offering sweetener after sweetener after sweetener, and what are you left with? Two bidders. So, I think so. In principle, you can say that you can get the valuation right by having throwing it open through the auction process. And the auction process is very attractive. But what we see here is that the anxiety to dispose of and realize revenues is so overwhelming that you're unlikely to get the valuation right. And wherever the valuation goes wrong seriously and a large public asset is involved, I mean, immediately you will have this cry of scam being raised, and then the paralyzing effects on a general policy will follow. So, we have gone through this so often. And in fact, I think that's one reason why, government as sort of seem to switch gears from privatization to asset monetization, because here you can at least say that, well, the asset is not sold forever, it's going to come back to us. Because I think the pitfalls in privatization, we already the IDBI stake sale is going on and on and on, and so I think we are now promised the completion of this thing in 22 or 23. And so you see, so I think we come back to
I will just say on IDBI, it's actually the simplest of the financial assets to sell is IDBI.
Yes.
Yet we have taken approximately 7 years to
right.
To nowhere.
Yes, to nowhere. Yeah. And so what happens? And there is a danger, in not completing this process quickly enough. Then what happens is that the asset is not only you don't even not only do you not realize the theoretical benefits of handing it over to private ownership, but you're going to mismanage it even more under public ownership. The asset is basically bleeding, so you're in some kind of Trishanku state. You're neither there nor here, and so this is the worst possible outcome. That and so and the short point I would make is that if you want to monetize the assets, I think the infrastructure investment trust route, where a National Highway Authority or Power Grid or whoever, all these other people, they give people a share in the assets, cash flows of the assets. I think it's a very straightforward thing. But as I said, that is not what would appeal to the large majority of corporate houses and others, because what they want is abnormal returns, which typically arise from undervaluation of assets.
Thank you very much, Professor Ram Mohan. I think all of you have raised very practical policy concerns in the proper implementation of this policy. It looks like it's going to be quite difficult for the government to do. And anyway, I must thank each one of you for sparing your very valuable time. I thank Manish Aggarwal, thank Professor Ram Mohan, thank Narayan Ramachandran, and also Professor Nagraj for giving us such a very nice and rounded view of the National Monetization Pipeline. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.